Ladies and gentlemen, we gather at a moment when the world's attention is fixed on a war that has already brought immense suffering. But hidden within this tragedy lies a danger even greater than the clash of armies or the fall of cities. In Ukraine, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest, a facility built to generate life-sustaining energy, is now caught in the crossfire of war. Each day it operates under siege, and each hour it remains exposed to violence. The line between control and catastrophe grows thinner. This is not a distant problem, not a regional matter to be watched from afar. It is a global emergency, one that threatens the health, security, and future of millions far beyond Ukraine's borders. And tonight, I ask you to see the fragile truth before us, to understand the stakes at hand, and to confront the urgent responsibility we share to prevent a disaster that would reshape the course of history. When we speak about conflict, we often measure its impact in terms of territory lost or gained, in the number of soldiers sent to the front lines, in the costs of rebuilding shattered cities. But in Ukraine today, the stakes rise to a level that defies ordinary calculation. At the heart of this fragile landscape stands the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, a facility designed to fuel economies, not wars. Yet in the midst of this ongoing conflict, it has been transformed into a stage where the possibility of disaster looms with each passing hour. To call it fragile is not an exaggeration. It is to recognize the razor's edge upon which millions of lives now balance. Think for a moment about what this plant represents. 6 reactors, each containing highly radioactive material, surrounded by systems that require stability, precision, and above all, safety. Nuclear power plants are not built to withstand bombardment, nor are they designed to operate under conditions of siege, with staff working under duress and infrastructure repeatedly disrupted. In times of peace, every detail of plant operation is monitored, checked, double-checked, controlled with meticulous caution. But war does not allow for meticulous caution. War replaces reliability with unpredictability, safety with uncertainty. And that is why we find ourselves today confronting the possibility of a crisis that could extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. What makes the situation so alarming is not simply the existence of nuclear facilities in a war zone. It is the repeated reports of shelling near the reactors, the damage to external power lines, the compromised access to cooling systems, the exhausted staff who work under unimaginable stress to keep reactors stable. In a nuclear plant, cooling water is not optional. It is the lifeline that prevents overheating, the shield against meltdown. And yet, in Zaporizhzhia, that lifeline has already been severed more than once due to the fighting. Each time, emergency systems have managed to take over. Each time, catastrophe has been narrowly avoided. But how many times can we rely on luck, on backup systems designed for rare accidents, not for sustained assault? The truth is, each incident erodes the margin of safety further, and each day the plant remains in this condition, the risks compounding. Let us not deceive ourselves into thinking that this is simply a local Ukrainian matter. Radiation knows no borders. The clouds do not pause at checkpoints, nor do they respect military front lines. If a reactor core is damaged, if cooling is lost, if containment fails, the effects would spread across regions, poisoning soil, water, and air. We do not have to imagine blindly. We have seen history's warnings. We remember Chernobyl, we remember Fukushima. Both taught us that even in peacetime, with no bombs falling and no gunfire echoing, nuclear accidents are devastating. Now imagine the same dangers compounded by war, by intentional or accidental strikes, by the breakdown of international oversight. This is the fragile reality Ukraine faces, and by extension, the reality we all must face. The staff of this plant are, in many ways, unsung heroes. They continue to show up, to monitor, to stabilize, despite working in conditions that none of us would tolerate in normal times. They operate under duress, sometimes unable to leave, sometimes threatened, always aware that one misstep or one strike could turn their daily routine into the trigger of a catastrophe. Their dedication keeps the facility standing, but dedication alone cannot shield steel and concrete from missiles. Dedication alone cannot rebuild severed power lines in the middle of a battlefield. The fragility extends beyond the physical plant itself. It is political fragility, informational fragility, and diplomatic fragility. Conflicting reports cloud the truth. Who is responsible for the shelling? Who controls which part of the facility? What systems are damaged? Which risks are being downplayed? When truth becomes a casualty of war, accountability disappears, and in the absence of accountability, danger grows unchecked. It is not only the walls of the reactor buildings that are vulnerable, it is the very framework of trust and verification that should ensure nuclear safety. Without clarity, without transparency, the international community is left reacting rather than preventing, hoping rather than ensuring. Some may ask, why does this matter so much when so many other tragedies already unfold in Ukraine? It matters because while cities can be rebuilt, land can be reclaimed, and economies can recover, the release of radiation would carve scars across generations. It would render lands uninhabitable. It would displace millions not temporarily, but permanently. It would sicken and kill silently, invisibly, long after the last weapon is fired. And unlike conventional weapons, nuclear disaster does not stop when the fighting stops. Its consequences endure for decades, even centuries. This is why we must describe the situation not as an exaggeration, not as political theater, but as a fragile reality, a precarious balancing act between catastrophe and containment. We are not speaking about probabilities that are distant or abstract. We are speaking about risks that have already brushed against reality multiple times during this conflict, and risks that grow each time fighting intensifies around the plant. One shell too close, one missile too far off course, one power outage unresolved, and the consequences will not be confined to maps of eastern Ukraine. They will redraw the map of Europe's safety itself. It is tempting, in the noise of daily news, to become numb, to think of warnings as distant alarms that never arrive. But history tells us otherwise. History tells us that accidents once thought unthinkable do happen. And here we are, not in the realm of accident, but in the realm of deliberate human conflict, where risks are multiplied by human decisions, human errors, and human ambitions. The fragility is not just in the steel and concrete of the Zaporizhzhia plant. It is in the willingness of the world to treat this threat with the urgency it demands. This is why I call it the fragile reality on the ground, because in every sense, it is reality and it is fragile. The reactors, the staff, the systems, the oversight, all of them are stretched to their limits. To speak honestly about this moment is to acknowledge that we are closer to disaster than we admit, and that complacency is the most dangerous illusion we can afford. The world has always been one mistake away from tragedy when it comes to nuclear power. In Ukraine today, that mistake could come not from malfunction or design flaw, but from war itself. And if war dictates the fate of a nuclear facility, then the outcome will not be measured in battles won or lost, but in lives shattered across borders and generations. This fragile reality must be recognized, not tomorrow, not after another close call, but today. Because every day that passes without decisive action is another day the world gambles with catastrophe. And when it comes to nuclear safety in the midst of war, gambling is not an option humanity can afford. That is why we must act before fragility becomes irreversible collapse. When we talk about the risks of a nuclear disaster in Ukraine, it is easy to imagine it as a problem contained within one country, as though radiation, contamination, and collapse could be confined to a single border. But the truth is harsher and far more unsettling, and the consequences of such a disaster would ripple outward, far beyond Ukraine itself, threatening the health, the safety, and the stability of entire regions, and reaching deep into the global system upon which all nations rely. This is not a crisis that can be isolated. It is a crisis that, by its very nature, transcends boundaries, and its impact must be measured not in miles or in borders, but in generations. Europe stands at the front line of these risks. Radiation does not recognize national sovereignty. It does not stop when it reaches Poland, or Romania, or Hungary. A single plume of contamination from an accident at Zaporizhzhia would travel on the winds, drifting across borders and skies, silently infiltrating fields and rivers. It would poison the soil that feeds millions, contaminate the waters that sustain countless communities, and infiltrate the air that citizens across multiple countries breathe. The memory of Chernobyl remains sharp in the minds of many Europeans, and it serves as a living warning of how quickly a local nuclear incident becomes a continental catastrophe. But unlike Chernobyl, which was an accident born of negligence in a single country, the Zaporizhzhia plant sits in a war zone where deliberate military actions could trigger disaster. That difference makes the stakes unimaginably higher. Consider what happens if this risk turns into reality. The first victims would, of course, be Ukrainians living near the plant. Their homes, their farmland, their entire livelihoods would be erased not by missiles alone, but by radiation that lingers long after. But the next victims would be their neighbors, farmers in Moldova, children in Slovakia, workers in Poland. Crops would wither, and trade would collapse, and panic would spread faster than the radioactive cloud itself. Europe, already grappling with an energy crisis and an unstable security environment, would find itself forced to manage a humanitarian disaster without precedent in modern times. And yet, the stakes extend far beyond Europe. Ukraine has long been one of the world's great breadbaskets, a producer of grain that feeds not just Europe, but Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. A nuclear disaster contaminating farmland would not only devastate Ukraine's agricultural capacity, but also cut deeply into global food supplies. The war has already caused disruptions to grain shipments, triggering spikes in food prices and sparking fears of famine in vulnerable regions. Imagine, then, the impact if radiation were to render entire swaths of farmland unusable for decades. Hunger would not stop at Ukraine's borders. Starvation, unrest, and migration crises would spread across continents, igniting new conflicts in regions already strained by scarcity. Energy security, too, is on the line. But Zaporizhzhia is not only a nuclear plant, it has been a key contributor to Ukraine's power grid. Its instability or destruction would further undermine Ukraine's ability to keep its lights on, its hospitals running, its industries functioning. But the impact does not end there. A nuclear incident would deepen the global energy crisis by driving fear of nuclear energy itself, fueling public distrust and political resistance. Countries that rely on nuclear power for clean energy might be forced to scale back, turning once again to fossil fuels at a time when the world is already struggling to fight climate change. In this way, The consequences of a single disaster could reverse years of global progress on energy and climate goals, binding future generations to the fallout of decisions made today. Beyond the immediate physical and economic effects lies another, equally dangerous dimension, but the erosion of global trust in nuclear safety. For decades, international frameworks and institutions have worked tirelessly to build standards and safeguards that reassure the world that nuclear power can be safe, reliable, and peaceful. A disaster in Ukraine, triggered by conflict rather than negligence, would shatter that trust. It would prove that even the strictest safety systems cannot withstand the chaos of war. Nations would question the safety of their own reactors, and the global nuclear order would fracture under the weight of fear. That fracture would not only undermine clean energy development, but could also weaken the very fabric of non-proliferation efforts. If civilian nuclear power becomes synonymous with vulnerability, the world's ability to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons would suffer as well. And we cannot overlook the psychological dimension. A nuclear disaster in Ukraine would not just poison fields and rivers, it would poison minds. The fear of invisible contamination, of an enemy that cannot be seen or touched, lingers long after the event itself. We saw it in Japan after Fukushima, where psychological trauma and displacement weighed as heavily as the physical damage. We saw it in Belarus and Ukraine after Chernobyl, where communities became haunted by the uncertainty of their own health, never knowing whether a diagnosis years later could be traced back to invisible particles released decades before. Multiply that trauma by millions, spread it across countries, and you begin to grasp the profound psychological shadow such a disaster would cast over Europe and beyond. This is why the stakes must be understood as both regional and global. For Europe, it is a matter of immediate survival, of protecting populations and preventing the collapse of shared systems of security. For the world, it is a matter of food and of energy, of trust, of stability. And for humanity as a whole, it is a test of whether we are willing to recognize that some risks are simply too vast to ignore. The narrative of this war has often been told through tanks and trenches, through territory and treaties. But the story unfolding around Ukraine's nuclear plants is one that redefines those boundaries. It is no longer a war between two nations. It is a war that threatens the health and stability of continents. It is not simply about who controls a city or a river, but about whether millions will have safe air to breathe and clean water to drink. It is not only about the courage of soldiers, but about the fragility of systems designed to safeguard humanity itself. And so, as we consider the fragile reality on the ground, we must also grasp the regional and global stakes that hang in the balance. This is not only Ukraine's crisis, it is Europe's crisis. It is the world's crisis. The lessons of history demand that we see the truth clearly, that nuclear disaster does not wait politely at borders, that hunger and displacement cannot be contained, that fear and instability are infections that spread faster than any radiation cloud. If we fail to act, if we choose to view this as someone else's problem, then we invite consequences that none of us will be able to escape. That is why the regional and global stakes must be acknowledged, must be confronted, and must be addressed with the seriousness they demand. Because in the end, the fallout of inaction will belong to all of us. If we accept the fragile reality on the ground and acknowledge the immense regional and global stakes at play, then the only path forward is clear. There must be immediate and coordinated international safeguards to prevent this crisis from spiraling into irreversible catastrophe. The time for hesitation is over. The time for vague statements and symbolic gestures has passed. What is needed now is urgent, concrete, enforceable action that places the protection of human lives above the pursuit of military advantage. We must begin by recognizing that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and indeed all nuclear facilities in Ukraine, cannot be treated as ordinary military assets. They are not prizes to be captured, nor strongholds to be fortified. They are not weapons, though in the wrong hands they can unleash destruction greater than any conventional arsenal. These facilities are, in truth, humanitarian lifelines, and their protection must be placed under a regime that transcends the battlefield. The international community has the means to create that regime, but only if the will exist to do so. Neutral monitoring is essential. Independent inspectors, such as those from the International Atomic Energy Agency, but must be granted continuous, unhindered access to the plant, not symbolic visits, not staged tours, but permanent oversight that ensures the safety of reactors, cooling systems, and spent fuel storage. The world must not rely on conflicting reports from warring sides when the consequences of misinformation could mean disaster. Inspectors must be empowered to tell the truth, to sound alarms when danger rises, and to report directly to the global community rather than being caught in the political crossfire of conflicting narratives. But monitoring alone is not enough. The very environment around the plant must be secured. That requires the establishment of a nuclear safety corridor, a demilitarized zone where weapons are withdrawn, where shelling is forbidden, where the only objective is the preservation of safety. Some will argue that such a corridor is impossible in the midst of war. Yet, what is truly impossible is imagining that the world can survive a nuclear meltdown born of military recklessness. We have seen ceasefires brokered for humanitarian aid, for evacuations, for prisoner exchanges. Is the protection of Europe's largest nuclear plant any less urgent? The answer is clear. If there is political will to save lives, then there must be political will to create and enforce such a corridor. International cooperation must extend beyond immediate oversight and safety zones. It must include enforceable guarantees. When lines of communication break down, when agreements are violated, when shelling resumes near the plant, the response cannot be muted outrage. There must be consequences, real and immediate, for endangering a facility whose stability affects not only the combatants but the entire world. Too often, international institutions are criticized as powerless, issuing statements that carry no weight. But power is not simply granted. It is exercised when nations decide to act collectively. If ever there were a moment for collective action, it is now. With a nuclear facility perched on the brink of disaster, we must also broaden the circle of responsibility. This is not solely the responsibility of European powers, nor only of Ukraine's allies. Nations across the globe, from Asia to Africa to the Americas, must recognize their stake in this crisis. A nuclear disaster in Ukraine would poison food chains that reach every continent, disrupt energy markets worldwide, and erode trust in systems that underpin global security. It is therefore the duty of all nations, not just those closest to Ukraine, to demand and enforce safeguards. This is not about East or West, about alliances or rivalries. It is about survival, about the preservation of a shared planet. Technology and expertise must also be mobilized. Nuclear safety is a field where knowledge can save lives, where the sharing of best practices and emergency protocols can provide crucial resilience. International teams of engineers, scientists, and safety specialists must be ready to support Ukraine's operators, to repair damage swiftly, but to restore power lines, to reinforce cooling systems. These are not tasks that can be left solely to overworked staff operating under siege. They require the mobilization of the global community's collective expertise, and they require resources delivered with urgency. Some will say that the creation of such safeguards is nigh in a time of brutal war. They will argue that military logic prevails, that no side will willingly cede ground or advantage. But to accept that logic is to accept the unacceptable, that millions of lives can be endangered in pursuit of battlefield gains. History has shown us that even in the darkest wars, humanity has drawn lines that must not be crossed. We have treaties banning chemical weapons, conventions protecting civilians, rules governing the treatment of prisoners. Why should nuclear plants, whose destruction would scar generations, not deserve the same inviolable protection? The urgency is compounded by the fact that time is not on our side. Each day the plant operates under stress. Each night its reactors rely on emergency power to keep cooling systems running. Each time artillery echoes in the distance, the risk grows. Waiting for the war to end before securing these facilities is not an option. The safeguards must be established now, while there is still something left to protect. This is also a matter of moral clarity. If the international community cannot unite to safeguard a nuclear plant that threatens millions, then what hope is there for unity in addressing other crises? If we cannot act here, in the face of such a clear and present danger, then when will we act? If we allow this moment to pass, history will not forgive us. Future generations will ask why, with all our knowledge of past disasters, with all our understanding of nuclear risks, we stood by and did too little until it was too late. We must not allow complacency to write the next chapter of this story. We must not allow paralysis to be the response to a danger that demands decisiveness. International safeguards are not a luxury. They are not a distant ideal. They are the only barrier standing between the world and a catastrophe that could redefine human history. That is why the call must be urgent, and it must be relentless. Let us demand access for inspectors. Let us demand the withdrawal of weapons from the plant's vicinity. Let us demand enforceable guarantees, and let us mobilize resources and expertise to protect what is too important to lose. Let us not look back on this moment and wish that we had spoken louder, acted sooner, cared more. The plant at Zaporizhzhia stands on the brink. It is not yet lost, but neither is it safe. The outcome will depend on whether the world treats this threat with the seriousness it deserves. If we act now, with courage and unity, we can avert disaster. If we fail, then the cost will not be measured in borders or politics, but in lives and generations. The choice is ours, and the time is now. We stand today at a crossroads where the fragile reality of Ukraine's nuclear plants, the immense regional and global stakes, and the urgent need for international safeguards converge into a single truth. This is not just Ukraine's crisis. It is humanity's crisis. The reactors at Zaporizhzhia are not distant structures on a map, but they are symbols of how close we all are to catastrophe when conflict and nuclear power collide. The dangers are real, the risks are rising, and the consequences would touch every one of us. History will not measure us by the words we speak in moments of calm, but by the actions we take in moments of peril. Let us ensure that when future generations look back on this time, they see not a world that stood paralyzed on the brink of disaster, but a world that found the courage to act. The call could not be clearer, nor the stakes higher. We must not wait for catastrophe to write the lesson for us. We must write it ourselves, here and now, with unity, with urgency, and with resolve. Because the price of inaction is unthinkable, and the cost of prevention is within our power. But the choice remains ours, and the time to choose is now.